So after 2 years of fighting, George Washington's world just started to crumble. People started criticizing him. Some people started saying he should just be replaced. He should be removed as commander in chief. And things got so bad that at one point Washington just offered to resign. That's what we're talking about today. And by the way, guys, if you enjoy these videos, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe, share the video with friends. I really appreciate it, and it means a lot to me. Now, we're going to start today in the winter of 1777. Now, Washington has just lost two big battles. The first is the Battle of Brandywine, where Washington basically lost the capital city of Philadelphia to the British, right? This is a big deal because Philadelphia was the capital of the United States. It's the place where Continental Congress would meet. And so losing Philadelphia meant that the Continental Congress, all these leaders literally had to run away and find somewhere else to meet. Okay, and so it's a big embarrassment for Washington. He's really embarrassed and tries to redeem himself in the Battle of Germantown by trying to recapture Philadelphia, but that doesn't work out very well for him, and he loses that too. So 6 days before Christmas, Washington has lost twice, and he hobbles his way into Valley Forge, where he and his men are going to camp out for the next 6 months, basically ride out the winter, right? Now, they start building temporary shelter for themselves, and Washington kind of takes a step back, and he looks out at his men with a mix of admiration and concern, a real deep concern, right? Because a lot of these guys, they don't have food, they don't have clothes, they don't have shoes, right? And some of them are literally leaving bloody trails in the snow as they march through it, right? So Washington writes at the time that his men are without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lie on, without shoes by which their marches might be traced by blood from their feet, and almost as often without provisions as with them. So he's like, look, man, things are really bad. Washington knows he needs help, and he sends a desperate letter to the Continental Congress asking them for help, right? He says, unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place, this army must inevitably starve, dissolve, or disperse. So, you know, he begs Congress for help, but Congress does nothing. They don't send anything to Washington, and he loses another 2,000 men at Valley Forge. Now, to make matters worse, some people start calling Washington incompetent. They're like, look, you know, this guy, he lost the Battle of Brandywine, he lost Germantown, he lost the city of Philadelphia, right? I mean, he's incompetent. What are we doing with this guy? Meanwhile, you have another general named Horatio Gates, who just won the first major battle of the Americans over the British, the Battle of Saratoga. So some people are like, why are we wasting our time with Washington? Let's get Horatio Gates in there. Some of Washington's own generals start to question whether he's the guy. You have this guy, General Thomas Conway. He writes a letter to Horatio Gates where he describes Washington as weak. And he says the guy's going to ruin his country. You have General Charles Lee, who writes an article that's published in a Pennsylvania newspaper blasting Washington, criticizing his military mind, his military strategy. And the problem for Washington is that it's not just a couple of generals. You have members of Congress who start criticizing Washington as well. You have Richard Henry Lee, you have John Adams, Samuel Adams, right? They're criticizing Washington, but it's not being done publicly, right? There's sort of whispers in the halls of Congress, and there's private letters and correspondence between these guys. You have Benjamin Rush, who's the most famous doctor in America. He writes a letter to his best friend, John Adams, where he says Washington was outgeneraled and twice beaten. And he criticizes Washington. And then he looks at Washington's army and he says, these guys are an unformed mob. And he compares that to General Horatio Gates, right? The winner, the victor of the Battle of Saratoga. And he says, this guy's army is a well-regulated family, right? Unformed mob, well-regulated family. I mean, people are starting to really suggest that it's time for Washington to go. Things get worse in January 17th. 1778, somebody drops off a pamphlet, anonymous pamphlet, on the steps of the Continental Congress. Now, this pamphlet, called Thoughts of a Freeman, basically blasts Washington and says that the whole war effort is doomed unless Washington and all of his supporters are banished from the camp. Meanwhile, Washington, he's stuck at Valley Forge, but he learns of all this stuff. I mean, he hears about the Whisper Campaign, he learns about this pamphlet, and instead of fighting it, he does something that turns out to be actually pretty brilliant. He offers to resign. He says, look, guys, I don't have to be doing this, okay? And if you don't want me as your commander-in-chief, no problem, I'm happy to step away. He writes to a friend saying, whenever the public gets dissatisfied with my services, or a person is found better qualified to answer her expectations, I shall quit the helm and retire to private life with as much content as ever the wearied pilgrim felt upon his safe arrival at the Holy Land. Now, the statement is published and starts making, the rounds. And people are like, well, you know what? Maybe Washington isn't that bad. And they stop criticizing him. They stop challenging his authority and letting him do his job. And actually, by the time Washington and his men pull themselves out of Valley Forge in June of 1778, they are better disciplined, they're better trained, they're more confident, and they're tougher than ever before. And they're ready to start changing the tide of the war. Washington, of course, at least for now, has his job safe. Now, things don't work out quite as well for the generals who were criticizing him during this difficult time. Remember this guy, General Thomas Conway, the one who sent a letter to Horatio Gates calling Washington weak? Well, he's challenged to a duel, and he's shot in the mouth by another general who supports Washington. That guy, the other general, is actually really pleased with what he's done. He brags to his friends that he says, well, at least I stopped his lying mouth. Conway writes an apology letter to Washington, which Washington never answers, and then he moves to France to just get away from all the craziness. Then you got this guy, Charles Lee. This is the general who wrote a really stinging criticism of Washington in a Pennsylvania newspaper. He's also challenged to a duel, and he's shot in the side by another general who supports Washington. And then he's basically thrown out of the army. Now, if we're being really honest, okay, Washington's critics weren't entirely wrong. Okay, Washington was not a military genius. Most people, who write books about Washington, biographies about Washington, they'll agree. The guy was not a military genius. He lost more battles than he won, right? He never had a single major smashing victory in a battle against the British. But what he did have was amazing leadership qualities, right? Because during these really difficult, challenging times, Washington kept his people together, and he kept them moving forward, and he stayed as their leader all the way through to the very end of the war, the final battle, the battle that changed the war, the Battle of Yorktown. This is a battle that Washington won with some major help, actually, from a slave named Armistead. But that's a story we'll get into in the next video.